Hi all. So thank you for making time and coming. So we're gonna discuss again the risk budgeting because it has become a quite a passionate subject of the summit this year. So we're gonna take these 2 hours, or maybe less, or maybe more, depending, to discuss what we really want to come up with. What would be our outcomes from the summit about risk budgeting, and how can we make this a real thing for other people to use, or how can we influence the industry? So Dennis is not able to join us today, and I was just asking about any volunteers to lead the session. So okay, great. So we have the previous notes in the chat window, and we have talked about measurements, risk velocity, many different new terminologies for me, like stuff like dependency drift, for example. I think AJ was the one who talked about that. I have no idea what dependency drift is. So one of the outcomes of the actual session would be to come up with these terminologies and explain them to a wider audience. So jump in, please. I'm just the facilitator here. You guys are the brains. Hi, Phil. Hi, Tony. And we have a few more people joining in.
Phil's here at last.
I think I will have to re-paste the notes into the chat window because you only see the text that is posted after you joined. So I'm posting it again. There will be 3 messages, 3 long messages.
Really helpful, thank you. Because I missed the session last week, so I feel like I've got a bit of a gap that I need to fill.
So where shall we start? What does risk budgeting mean to you? And why do you think it's important?
So I've read Omar's blog and about this concept of risk budgets. I still think risk is the wrong term here. I think a risk traditionally has an event and a consequence, and it's usually about some level of uncertainty on objectives. A lot of what we were talking about and is covered in the blog post is more the measurement and characteristics of systems that would contribute to a risk but are not in itself the risk. So they are the sorts of things like risk factors. So if we have more unpatched vulns, the risk of a remote attack leading to a loss of funds is higher, for example. But the presence of unpatched vulns is not inherently a risk unless we know that that's going to lead to a consequence such as a loss of funds.
I think when we talked about it in the previous meeting, we said it's not a risk, but things that, like you said, reduce risk, or even better, pointers to other risks. Like if you have a lot of vulnerabilities, it's probably going to impact your risk exposure. So maybe risk wasn't a good term, but for simplicity and keeping things not too much complex, I think risk might be a good word, although it's not mean what everyone agrees on.
I haven't had a chance. I'm picking up the blog at the moment and trying to catch up with where we got to last week. So apologies for that. But on that, I think if it's not common terminology and we're kind of not misusing, but we're kind of appropriating words for different things, A lot of what I've seen in lots of organizations, problems stem from confusion around terminology and how we're using language. So I think we should be converging on a set of definitions and what they are, in what they mean, rather than misappropriating or reappropriating words, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a lot of common taxonomy which is now being sort of solidified around risk in that. If you look at the SciBox, the common body of cyber knowledge, that's been a work in progress between the NCSC and numerous universities and centres of excellence. So to, like you say, Robin said, if you depart from that too much, then either people don't understand it or will, sort of not use it.
It's an emotional term, risk, unfortunately. It brings a lot of baggage with it. But, I mean, this concept of a security budget that leads to security risk, I think, is hugely valuable.
You call it security economics.
It's almost like there might be a conference about that. So there's an interesting thing, which is a lot of the SRE budgets, service levels and the like relate to the delivery of a service. So an SLO is, how many requests are we going to serve off an API successfully? Well, sorry, how many requests will we serve? The error budget is usually then how many requests are we allowed to have fail before we reach our service level indicators, if I'm getting the trifecta set up properly. The interesting thing with the security issues is that they are indirectly part of the service. So I can use that API all I like and it can be insecure. I may have an expectation of security, but it doesn't stop me using it. And that's true of a number of
That's why security is usually a non-functional.
Non-functional, that's the words I was looking for, thank you.
But all the SLO are non-functional. Sorry for interrupting, but it's not a functional request that a service will respond to all requests in time or that request will not fail. It's a non-functional request either way. So it's pretty much like security.
So interestingly, and this would be almost, I suspect, impossible to measure, you would want in a security budget to be talking about numbers of malicious requests, for example, or numbers of successful malicious requests below a value. If you were following the sort of similar mental model that some of the SLO, SRE type measures are going, I don't know how we would get there, but that is a very interesting place, which would be to relate the security nature of the service performance, if that makes sense. But I'm open to understanding how we might measure indirect security things that we care about, but service users probably are blind to.
No, Phil, not every security event is the same, is it? The consequences would be different.
Yes. But for example, I as a security manager of a platform might care greatly that I've got 500 unpatched remotely exploitable vulnerabilities versus 100. But my users, as long as they can access the platform and are getting the service they expect, what they would care about is that big risk event, which is the platform is breached. But the breach is not, I mean, we already have measures of that, which is how many breaches have we had, and usually the target level is 0. But the setting budgets for things that may lead to a breach, that's it. I don't, somehow we need to sort of, how do we square that with a service focus, a service, or if that's what we're looking to do. So if it's, has the service delivered on expected performance in security? What does expected performance in security for the end user look like?
So like key risk indicators, right? Leading stuff that would inform a risk scenario,
Also,
risk analysis.
risk
Yeah.
appetite. So many companies say they're fine with the low risk vulnerabilities, but when those low risk vulnerabilities are changed, nobody really looks at that because nobody has the time to really examine those internally.
Well, so there's some interesting stuff that comes out when you start stopping worrying about how many precisely I've got of each type, but you worry about the velocity of bugs in versus bugs out, for example. So is my ratio of newly discovered vulns versus old vulns that are now unpatched, is that in a good place? And if I can keep that ratio in a good place, then I assume my risk outcomes are going to be the ones I'm looking for.
So is that the time to update? Is that the terminology for that? We got that from the last session, time to update. I think that was meant to be that.
I mean, that's just an example of one measure. I mean, any measure is going to need to have a time frame on it to be valuable. But for example, rather than saying how many of a thing I've got, saying how many new ones I get and how many old ones I get rid of, tells me something about the performance of my security aspects of my service, which is how well am I at patching bugs, for example. So maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's security services that we need to work out. For any platform, what are the security services we expect to be running? And then what would the criteria be for those to be successful versus not successful, rather than direct platform management, if that makes sense.
And in that context, we had talked about cost of delays. So I think that's not specific to the metric, but it's for giving the context. So what if I don't patch this mainframe? Or if I don't patch this knowingly, what's the delay? What's the cost? What's the impact on the company or the product or whatever we're concerned about?
So the thing is, once you start getting towards impact and consequence, we're back in risk territory, which is, you know, a place I'm very comfortable, but I'm not sure most system engineering teams want to be thinking about business consequences. I think what they want to be thinking about is the performance of their administrative processes and how that produces better security outcomes, if that makes sense.
Does, but we are talking about risk. So, and maybe it's not just going to be, who did you say, system engineers? Or one team. That's part of the problem we're trying to solve. It's one team is doing one set of metrics. Security might be doing some KRIs, but we're not really solve the problems because we're not really working together.
So I would, and okay, maybe I've missed the point of this, but my view is if you're in an SRE world, it isn't the security team that are delivering your security outcomes. It's your engineering teams that are delivering your security outcomes, and your security team are effectively expert advisors, but they're just there to help point, you know, very good engineering teams in the right direction. Then it's for the engineering teams to work out what the right thing to do is and how to get there. But that might just be my way of looking at these things.
No, it's a good step forward if your SRE teams and your security teams are already talking. Many places that's not even happening. So
I think this is one of the advantages of maybe the terms weren't defined very well, but it should be on a team level and not on a service level. And then you look on the 3 dimensions. You have the indicators, which indicate, it's kind of like the KRIs, the key risk indicators, things that you use to measure what is the risk exposure of this team, how many high vulnerability they have, or how many SaaS finding they have in the last month or stuff like that. So this is the first level, and then you use the objective. This is how you define the numbers. And where it gets interesting is, this is, I think, part of what Phil was talking about, the agreement. This is where you say to your users, this is what I want to do. We as a company going to agree that we are not going to release anything into production with high vulnerability, for example. And by doing that, I think it's part of what Phil was talking about. And I imagine having a status page for your company also showing that, for example. Not sure if that can work. And the risk budget is a bit different. This is where the time frame gets into situation. It's basically look on a specific time frame, how many times the objective you defined were breached. So if in all this time frame it was breached, 100% of your budget was burned. And this is just a way for us to model the trade-off we always have between functional and non-functional requirements, because we all agree we shouldn't invest in security all the time. So by having a specific level of budget agreed between all the stakeholders, we can starting to justify security investment.
Okay, quite a lot to unpack there. I get where you're coming from. Team, not service is interesting. That's a bit of a step I wasn't expecting, but I get it, and I do that in one of the places I'm working at the moment. So, you know, vulnerability management is an example where I am tracking, like I say, new vulns added to the environment that we are aware of, old vulns removed from the environment as a ratio by team. There is a policy which is, you know, all vulns patched within 30 days. But the ratio, yeah, I mean, I saw that look. That's because we're in an environment where we blow most of the servers away every week. But the ratio of new in to old out is my leading indicator on, am I going to end up with more risk in my systems?
MTTR, minimum time to remediate or recovery.
Well, if you imagine the service level objective for me as the customer of those teams is all bugs patched within 30 days. The leading indicator that tells me whether or not we're going to get into trouble on that is around bugs in, bugs out as a ratio.
It's whether that is an uphill gradient or a downhill gradient, right? Yeah. If it all of a sudden becomes a really steep gradient because you've had, you know, historically that you can fix, I don't know, 200 vulnerabilities a month, and all of a sudden you start getting 5,000 come in this week, you can be pretty sure you're not going to fix them all by the end of the month, aren't you? So that's kind of where you're getting
with a ratio is when you acquire a new company, you suddenly get a whole bunch of new vulnerabilities. Now, did you get more risky?
Yes,
probably. Yeah. But what you can do by using the ratio is you can very quickly step away from, we're now twice as big as we used to be, into, but are we performing as well as we used to be?
Yeah.
Which I found useful. You know, another example of a policy statement. So I think my no bugs older than 30 days is a policy statement. It's not a leading indicator. That's when the budget is blown. You've got a 30-day budget, but the ratio is telling me something about how you're doing. Another one a colleague of mine set up once was with his static code analysis, no new high bugs in production ever. You know, his problem was he needed to turn the tap off before he could start mopping up the water, I think was his best analogy for that. So I think there's an interesting difference for security policy statements, which are basically the security service level objectives that, if you imagine the CISO as a customer, might place on teams, versus the measurements we might make of team performance. So absolutely, you patched everything within 30 days, but your ratio is slipping. So maybe in a couple of months, you ain't going to be patching in 30 days because it's getting worse, for example.
Okay, so in a way, risk budgeting leads to appropriating the resources or getting more resources or using them more effectively?
Yeah, so I'm always a big believer in, if somebody's responsible for running something, they should run it, not me. If they're really bad at it, I might suggest that I could do it better. But ultimately, what I should be doing as the CISO is saying, here is the limit. Here is the point at which we can go no further. And that's my job as the risk owner for security, to say, actually, this is security risk. This is a risk that we can not tolerate. And I've been told by the board I can't tolerate. But what I should also be doing is working with those teams that says, it's not just breach equals 0, because that's terrible. Nobody's then got any indicators on how well they're doing. I need to find those other measures that allow.
Congrats, you failed.
Yeah, once a month, boom. So another good one was in identity and access management, which was there's a limit of time in which we clear out leavers, that they no longer have accounts in the environment. That's a policy. That's not a measure of performance. You breach it or you don't. I need to think about what I measure. One of our measures of performance in that area was when we recertified permissions, how many were wrong the first time, which was an indicator that somewhere along the line we were setting up accounts wrongly. There was no policy that said 0 must be wrong the first time you look at them, because that's crazy. But as a measure of how well we're doing at setting up and managing permissions since the last time we recertified, it's an indicator. I think maybe there's an interesting distinction there between the SLO, the security SLO, which is the policy limit, I guess, and the indicators, the SLIs, which tell us how well we're performing. And maybe that's where we need to start thinking about some distinction.
Also depth that's coming to mind here in terms of what we are casting as a high and the definition of a high. And if it's just looking at it very quantitatively in terms of numbers are patched, what's coming in, what's coming out, it's like, but if a whole bunch of the ones that are coming in are not exposed, or there's other controls around it that are compensating against that, then the residual risk isn't necessarily moving. So we can take decisions to direct our results. Sorry, somebody's creating a building work next door, if that's just kicked in at the wrong moment when I decide to talk. But yeah, it's if we have clear language. Hang on, is that coming through on the microphone? The guys.
We can hear you. It's fine.
Okay. All right. I'll shut the door in a minute when I shut up. Yeah, whether or not we've got compensating controls, and whether or not the language that we use with the team to prioritize with them in their straightforward high, medium, low, or the prioritization factors this all in, or if we're just going from some other sort of arbitrary risk scoring.
Yep. I mean, there are better ways of measuring these things.
Yeah.
Jumping from CVSS onto one of the like the Kenner intelligence informed view of vulnerabilities is a much better step forward. But until you've got access to that Kenner intelligence stream, you are using CVSS because it's the best game in town, unless you're prepared to sit down and validate each one individually, which is then quite a lot of work for everybody. So I totally get it, but there are times when you take what's available in the environment and you say, okay, if that's a baseline here and it's consistent, then I'll measure off that.
If it's not a metric that's not in place, then any metric's better than nothing, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
You can start down, and the trending of how you're doing, whether you're getting better or getting worse at a metric, is the one that's the most valuable to track, and then you can improve the metric that you use at a later point.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things in there. One is the metric still has to be a good one, so it has to be consistent and reliable. So if that same thing you're measuring is different every month for a whole variety of reasons, then there ain't not a lot of point measuring it. Improving over, well, okay, first thing, a lot of metrics are indicators, not direct measures. So we will measure something that will tell me if the team is doing well, but it's not a direct measurement of team performance. It's an indirect measurement of the output of something the team does. And it's quite important to bear that in mind, because if you treat metrics as a thing, as a real thing, and your budget as a real thing rather than an indicator, then people manage purely to that. They don't think that it's telling them something. They think it is something. And of course, most of the time, how many, like you say, if I've got a 500 high versus 400 high CVSS scores. That's not a thing. That's an indicator of how well I'm managing my vulnerability management. So there's that. The other thing is metrics mature over time. So in one organization I worked with, we rolled out a large metrics collection program, large organization, global, and we started off at about 15% completion. It took a year and a half to get up to about 86, 87% completion. And that's, you know, sometimes you just report not enough data and you just keep going, because over time that establishes the new normal. So you have to sort of leave space for people to get better at being able to measure, because even measuring takes time and effort sometimes to turn on. I should stop talking for a while.
Yeah, I'm big into what you're saying about repeatability and stability of the metric. Because what we're trying to do with any metric is manage and drive a behavior, right? We're measuring something because we're hoping we can learn from what we're measuring to be able to do something better or improve something. So yeah, maybe the question is to what are the behaviors we're trying to drive, and does the metric match that?
Yes, absolutely. You know, what I'm trying to do is to make sure my teams are thinking about remediating bugs, not pushing buttons to make sure the numbers are in the right place.
Yeah, it's that starting point, isn't it? If we're getting people to have that cultural change is embedded, we can then refine the metric later. If we spend all the time trying to get the perfect metric and confusing everybody, they're not going to be moving the dial and actually doing the work, that behavior that we want.
There's also, and I've run into this is really dangerous, a whole bunch of stuff in security is really hard to change, even given everyone's best efforts. And if you start setting levels so that things look, you know, red, amber, green, and all the rest of it, which I've done mistakenly, and things are red, and you're going to take you 2 years to change it. Senior executives receiving a red report on a monthly basis get really irate. And it doesn't really matter that these are hard things to change that are going to, you know, you're waiting for a system to go end of life and be replaced before you can actually fix that problem, because there's no point spending the money now. Doesn't matter, it's red, they want it fixed. So there is also a maturity in how you present and visualize performance back to the business, which can be, you can get yourself into trouble with.
So there was a question from the previous notes. Are risk factors the same as proxy measures?
I think so.
I would, yeah, I think I think they're likely to be one and the same. I'm sure there's a case where you can find an example where they're not, but.
So I'm a bit of a risk purist, but the fact that I've got a vulnerability exposed to the internet is a thing. The fact that somebody comes along and exploits that vulnerability and then steals money from me is a risk event. The fact that might happen requires the ability to steal the money. It requires the hack to have occurred and the use of the vulnerability. The presence of the vulnerability is not a risk unless it is also co-located with something that will cause me harm. Whereas risk factors,
I think that's kind of exemplified where you see risk registers and things that say things like there is a risk of heart bleed, and you kind of go, well, yeah, that isn't a that isn't a risk, or there is a risk that DLP fails. Like, you know, again, that's a control failure rather than a risk to the business. So,
but what I can have is a risk event such as remote compromise of my payment system, leading to the consequences of someone stealing loads of money and me losing my regulatory permission to do payments. And a factor in understanding my risk exposure would be, how many vulnerabilities do I have?
Yeah.
If that goes up, it indicates that my risk has gone up. But it's not, the vulnerability itself is not the risk. The vulnerability is just telling me, am I more or less exposed to that risk every time I measure it?
Yeah.
But that said, I do think learning from the SRE crowd on how they are measuring performance and thinking about that from a security point of view is an interesting and new way of thinking, because I think historically we've not, most security metrics have been what can we measure.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of a if you kind of brand it as an AppSec budget or something like that, and it's like, we know that you're not going to be able to do everything every time, but as long as you're within these guide rails, then this is then that's we appreciate those endeavors and that you're trying to do the right thing. I guess for me, where it's perhaps slightly different is if you've got black or white kind of must or must not type scenarios that are not something that is an optional, I can spend a bit of my budget on it. This is something that, to pick up on your previous example, if you've got a policy that is there are no reds or no highs in production ever, even if you could do that within your AppSec budget or whatever, the kind of those SRE concepts, there might be other things there where you're kind of saying, oh, that's that's not permissible because and it may not be a voluntary thing like that where you've chosen to apply it. It might be a contractual or a regulatory thing that says, you must do it in this way. And I don't, maybe I'm not familiar enough and kind of experienced enough in those things. Maybe that does fit within those concepts well. But yeah, I think that for me is where I could see there being need to kind of do some more thinking and kind of.
So whenever you have a statement of policy, which I think is what an SLO looks like, you end up with an exceptions process because there is always a case somewhere where the policy cannot apply. How you manage and govern an exceptions process is a big deal. And that's where your risk tolerance creeps up over time and people don't realize.
Yeah. And that's the bit for me that I would be happy to be proved wrong on, but where I would have kind of a be a little want to understand more around the idea of this budget and that kind of thing, that it doesn't just at the end of the quarter, it's not like it resets, right? If you've spent 90% of your budget over that quarter, at the end of the quarter, it's not like the following day that gets reset in the way that it does in the SRE world.
I think it depends what you measure.
Yeah.
So if we're measuring performance over time, then we can reset it.
Yeah, then you can reset it. If it's yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, if we were measuring discrete counts of something, so there can be no more than 5,000 of these things, we now have 5,001, then yes, restarting at the next quarter, starting from zero, even though you've actually got 5,001, it doesn't work. But saying that, I don't know, this config changes must, 99% of config changes must have gone through configuration management.
Change review, yeah.
That you can reset because over the time you say that's what happened. Let's put forward what's going ahead. And I think there is a distinction between a count of things and performance.
Yeah, so that would allow you to reset that. And I think as long as it's that kind of, like you say, the performance measurement rather than the specifics, because the kind of SRE world is inherently about that time bound performance, rather than stuff that, rather than the I suppose sticking with the financial terminology, the debt that can build up over time.
Yeah, debt's an interesting metaphor for this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things I've done in the past with metrics, and it's been at a more business focus level rather than engineering focus level, has been, rather than do the what can I measure approach, is the goals, question, metrics approach, which turns it on its head and says, what are the goals that we want to achieve in security? And generally those are going to be policy statements like, you know, all regulatory requirements will be met, sort of thing. The question part is then, what question would I ask myself to know if I've met that goal? And those are usually English language questions, and you get a handful of them together. And then you go into your environment and you look for things that you can measure that can tell you, when you answer that question, are you closer or further from your goal? And what that means is you're then measuring stuff which is directly related to the business goals and security rather than what the technology tells you. And I find it very useful in a business sense. Again, if we think about that in an SRE world, the SLO is kind of the goal. You know, the service level objective is the thing everyone's trying to achieve. The SLIs and the budgets and all the rest of it are your ways of asking questions about have you achieved, or are you going to achieve, or are you achieving that? So I think it's a similar perspective, but it's interesting because GQM tends to be business down, whereas SRE I think is a little bit more service down. Which is, you know, the same thing really, but just slightly different perspectives.
So how is risk budgeting? How formal is risk budgeting, and how is it different than tolerance and capacities and the risk appetite?
Yeah. So there's a lot of debate around terminology there. Generally, appetite is how much risk you want to take. And it makes a lot more sense in a financial sense that if I'm going to go and invest in the market and I've got £100,000 in my bank account and I'm prepared, my appetite is I'm prepared to put £80,000 at risk in the market to achieve a profit. If I've got £81,000 in the market, I'm beyond my appetite. Where somebody who is risk averse might say I'm prepared to put £10 in the market. So appetite is about how much you're prepared to do to achieve your goals. Tolerance is a little bit different because tolerance is how much risk are you actually prepared to live with. There's an interesting legal definition called as low as reasonably possible in the UK. There's a US version of it, and it combines minimizing risk to an acceptable level with the cost of minimizing that risk. And effectively, if somebody died because it was way too expensive to stop them from dying, you're okay. So generally, a lot of risk management is based on as low as reasonably possible as a strategy. And what that usually means is you have a definition of how much risk you want to take, or you are prepared to get up to. And anything below that is tolerable, and anything above that is intolerable and must be dealt with. The problem is you end up then with the middle ground, which is things that are above your line of tolerance, but you can't do anything about. And rather than stop doing the business, what you do is you just tolerate them. So you end up with this funny place where you've got tolerable intolerables. Which is why the whole thing gets really debatable. And then risk capacity is kind of related, but it's how much risk you can take. So I might have an appetite of putting £80,000 of my 100,000 in the market. I might have a capacity of £100,000 because I can, I don't have a capacity of £101,000. So it's kind of they make more sense in the financial world. Budgets for risk. Again, in the financial world, if you have a risk appetite that's high and you don't meet it, so if I've got an appetite to put 80 grand in the market and I put 60 grand in the market, I've left money on the table that I could otherwise be making. So the whole goal in financial management is to run right up to your appetite, because that's how much you're prepared to lose, and that's the best, at that point, that's the most you can make.
Just if adding a few words if I can chime in. I think what I like the most about using this framework is exactly on those areas. If we go back to the example of vulnerabilities management and we take the MTTR, median time to remediate, so we can define that as the risk indicator, team risk indicator, or service risk indicator, or whatever. Playing with the objective and the error budget is how we play with our risk appetite. So the objective is how we set the goal where we want to achieve. For example, we can define MTTR as 7 days. And this is one way we can play with that. And the second thing is the error budget. When we decide that we burned enough from the budget and we need to start investing in security. So if, for example, we look on a month, and on this month we looked how much of this month we breached the MTTR, how many days from the 30 days in the month, we looked on the MTTR and it was longer than 7 days. And it's like, for example, 20%, which is, let's say, a week. And we decided on 20% we stop doing functional work and we start to do security work. This is another way we can play with risk appetite. So by letting each team define their objective and their risk appetite, which are two different numbers, but the combinations of both of them allow you to define different metrics of appetite. The first one is what you want to tolerate, how long, what is the longer MTTR you are willing to live with, and the second one is the balance between functional and not functional. And I think having those two numbers could lead to a very interesting conversation between product developers and security persons.
So the budgets, risk budgets, are they something that can be documented?
It's just a number. You basically look on, it's a very simple calculation. You need to define a time frame, for example, 30 days, and look in this time frame how many times the objective you defined was breached. So for every day, you look what was the MTTR on this day, and if it's bigger than the objective, you count this day as a breach. And then you sum all of them, divide them by the number of time it wasn't breached, and this is give you the number. So you just need to agree on which number, on which percentage you drop everything you're doing and start working on security.
Thank you. Phil has just sent the blog post is written. What is this about, Phil?
So this is, I hope, relevant, but it sort of lays out some of these concepts. One of the things I realized was that the goals of management tended to be to spend as little time and as money on security as they could in order to spend their time and money on generating value, which is a perfectly laudable outcome. Some management are prudent in that and some management are not. That's where the problems come in. However, my experience was that an awful lot of security teams work on eliminating all risk. Every opportunity they get, they eliminate risk. And actually, there was a real conflict between controls that were too tight, controls that were limiting the business, and being able to generate value. And it became very clear when I was working in a very conservative, old school organization that was trying to go through a digital transformation. And the things you take for granted in a digital cloud first business were almost impossible because the security controls didn't allow for it. And the security teams were working on an old school view of we're on premise, nobody's allowed to do anything that we don't tell them, which is not how the business wanted to operate. So I started writing this blog to try and get across this sense that we can take too much risk and that heads to a bad territory. But if we don't take enough risk, that actually in itself does cause harm as well. And that's what I was trying to get across this blog, is that there's that. But I still think that was at the risk and controls level rather than necessarily the metrics level, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I'm again looking at the old notes to see if we can do something meaningful.
Is the if I've understood this correctly, is it fair to say that the problem, if you like, that we're trying to solve, talking about risk budgeting, AppSec budgeting, however you want to kind of the terminology that goes with it, is the relationship between security team and development team, and ensuring that the right amount of effort and resources put on security improvements rather than just business functional requirements. Is that a fair kind of description of the kind of more scope of what we're talking about?
I don't know.
Because we talked around a couple of different ideas and concepts there, and all of them really interesting. And I guess we need to decide, what is it that at the end of the day is going to be a session or not? That's kind of where we're trying to get to? Is that right, Ida?
So this all came about when we were. This all came about from Omar's blog post on Twitter, and Dennis invited him to open the discussion in the community because it's quite an interesting subject.
Yeah.
But we didn't start out with a clear aim, so that's why we're having so many sessions on how can we create value with this topic.
Okay.
For the industry. Common language, terminology, understanding of the business, and as you guys both said, security should not be the people who say no and stop the business. We're not the boss. We are here for the business. If the business isn't there, we're not there. Understanding them and making them understand the security and measures and metrics is a good way of showing them, look, we have something wrong here, we should focus on this. Prioritizing our controls or budgets and resources. And how can we use risk budgeting in all this environment? What does it mean? How can it be applied? And Amar is talking about that with the three classes.
Okay.
So there's no right or wrong. I think it's a journey we're in together.
The best things always are, right?
Enjoy the journey. And we still have another hour to talk about this. So guide rails. We have been talking about guide rails, but so we have the appetite, we have policy limits, we have indicators, objectives, the budget, we have guide rails, we have exception process. So are some of these similar to each other, or are they all different concepts in their own right? Like the objectives and the policy limits, they do sound quite similar because they're both like your limits and your targets where you should stay in. But are they used interchangeably or are they different?
So I think they're all used as goals. I think policies tend to be rigorously applied. I think objectives are targeted rather than necessarily enforced. I don't know, there's a funny way of putting it. So everyone tries to achieve an objective, but people are hang on a minute, I need to so I think there is a relationship. Just a sec, I'll be back. Yeah,
okay. Anyone want to continue? Oh, Phil is back. Okay.
Are these things the same? Yes, they are. And I think there is some value absolutely in mapping the language so that we can take from one to the other. I think there's a huge amount of value in defining the differences between them. So, you know, is a budget the same as an appetite, or is the budget the same as a tolerance? I think there's some useful definitional work that can be done there, and I'm going to spend some time thinking about that. But the other thing is, whereas in metrics we tend to measure the business almost we do it to them. The nice thing about budgets and service levels from the SRE perspective is it's something that they internalize and do for themselves. And I think there's an interesting conversation about how do we make these things stop being something for security in order for us to tell them you should do that or shouldn't do that, but become something for them so that they can tell themselves we need to be doing better at this. I think that's an opportunity. Hello, Ben.
Hey, sorry guys, had a clash with another call. What did I miss in the last hour?
You can replace me because I've got to now drop off.
Yeah.
Hey, Tony, I'll grow a beard.
All right. Cheers, guys.
So we did talk about a few things that we talked about before as well. We're still talking about the stuff. So
No problem. I've just one of those any highlights. It's okay. I'll keep quiet.
I'll post my notes from today into the chat window for you.
Perfect.
I think we need a clear purpose of the session. I think we've got a lot of good stuff to talk about, but I think we need a clear goal for the session itself. What is it we're trying to produce?
Yeah.
So we can be clear what it is we don't need to talk about.
I agree.
Yeah. Because this is more of the business kind of track, isn't it? I mean, we had the conversation, Phil, about, I don't know if you've obviously, I've seen you put your link onto your blog, but about things you just are mandatory, things that are risks and things that are continuity plan response. But I don't know if you've got a neat phrase that summarizes that all together.
We actually haven't gone into that.
Oh, okay.
We were talking more about appetites and tolerances. So effectively, Omer has proposed bringing some of the language and approaches from service reliability engineering, SRE as defined by Google, into security measurement.
Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant idea. What we've sort of danced around a little bit the fact that we are already using some of the language in slightly different ways, so we need to be careful not to sort of cross the streams, if that makes sense, so that we don't confuse. But I think we also, there's a couple of things we need to look at in terms of, are we looking at service measurement, team measurement? Are we looking at measurement from security or measurement for security, and those sorts of things?
And stepping right back, I mean, for me, the issue here is, and we've had this conversation, that when you look at risk in a financial institution, it's quantified, and you have to market every day. If you're in insurance, you have an actuary that says, here's the value of a risk. And quite often, and this, you've made this point about measuring risk, is we have this word called risk, but it's red, amber, green. And so when you go to the CFO and say, I want to spend 100 grand on doing that, he says, well, what's the size of the risk? Well, it's $100 million risk impact. And what's the likelihood? 1%. And I want to spend $2 million. Well, for me, that sum doesn't add up, but there isn't that maturity of conversation. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of the Open Security Summit is quite technical in nature. I was hoping that we were going to be able to do a bit of a primer on the conversation with the business from the security teams out, and get some of the, you've talked before about this modeling, Phil, you do, where you get the board to do that, the input for the simulation, to say what level of risk do they want to take and how do they value that, and then using that to get a quantitative framework. And then at least the risks that we're coming out of in this I won't call it a risk register because I know you don't like that term, but what we're coming out with here is something that you put alongside a hardware budget spend that says, I'm going to, you know, service a few more clients, or I'm going to reduce my headcount. You can say your risk mitigation is quantifiable, and that's why it should be put there alongside your foreign exchange hedge or whatever else you're doing in terms of quantifiable financial risk for the business.
And also, I think that was why in the previous session we said we should also use the established financial terms in our processes, because it's much easier for the finance or the CFO to understand, or the CEO to understand the risk when they see the familiar terms.
Yeah. But for me, what I was hoping to do, I mean, I'm doing this for the media supply chain, and where this is going to hit me, first of all, is there's a very small active community of security people building the security controls for media and entertainment. There's a whole bunch of people who are in the supply chain who've got, you know, security is just something they have to get through to be able to sell. So they want to just tick the box and get on with it. They're not really interested. And so it's bringing it forward to that community to say what the impact of this is in financial terms, why it's important, why they've actually got to register it, that they can't be flying blind on it. And especially what I'm finding going from cloud, from on, so normally in media and entertainment, you get fixed installations where you build an edit suite or a VFX suite and you spend $100,000 and that'll last for 3 years. So once your audit is fine. Once you start deploying stuff in the cloud, you have no room to hide. You can't, you know, you're one release away from disaster. So how do you make sure that people are always monitoring and checking rather than just doing the tick box once a year? So what I'm hoping is that, I mean, I'll do that kind of run through of what I'm doing on the session. What I'd hope to do is tie it back to this session and say, let's talk about risk and how you quantify risk in that context. Because then I think that it's probably meaningful to other people in terms of supply chain. But you know, I guess we'll see what people want to talk about.
So I think one of the pieces has been between measuring performance and measuring risk.
Yep.
My mind has always been that risk does involve consequence, which involves understanding the consequences on the business and on the people involved when a risk event occurs. Measurement for performance allows us to measure things that might tell us a risk event is more or less likely to occur. It might be able to tell us things about how well we could mitigate an event when it has occurred. So we might be able to measure things like our speed of response or those sorts of things.
So you're talking about impact and likelihood there, and the two multiplied together gives you a quantifiable risk. But what the first bit you said is, the second bit you had was about likelihood, about your performance measurement. Just can you go through that first bit again on impact?
So I tend to prefer likelihood and consequence. So okay. A risk is usually an event, something that happens, and one or more consequences as a result of that event.
Yeah.
In order to have that risk, you need to know how you'll be hurt by it.
Yeah.
What we can measure in a performance world is we can measure how much we are increasing the likelihood of a risk event occurring, or how much we're decreasing the chance for the risk event occurring. But we might also be able to measure the effectiveness of our ability to mitigate the consequences once the risk event has happened. So, for example, a web application firewall is going to prevent a SQL injection attack most of the time. A good instant response process that gets people on site very quickly and has lots of pre-trained people will quickly allow somebody to understand when an event has occurred, take decisions, and limit the damage.
Yeah.
If I don't have the web app firewall, I've got a much greater likelihood of the event occurring. If I don't have a good instant response process, I'm going to get hurt more when the event has occurred.
Yep.
So control versus mitigation. But what I can do is I can also look at how many SQL injection bugs do we create on a regular basis in our code. That is an indicator on whether or not I might get attacked with a SQL injection. And I could measure how many customer records I've got in a database. And if that goes up, that tells me how much harm how much consequence there's going to be.
Yeah.
So there is a difference between measuring the things like how many bugs there are and how many customer records there are, which tell us something about how big or small the risks get, and then what the risks themselves actually are, which is the event and the consequences.
And when you've got very big events that happen very infrequently, how do you measure those? Is quite difficult, and that's where you need to have a simulation. Is that right?
Yes. There's lots of different strategies for that. Currently in financial services, the regulators are treating those as they are going to happen. And so rather than telling people they should have a risk tolerance, they're telling them they should have an impact tolerance. And there should be no...
Resilience, basically.
It is resilience, but at no point should you be doing likelihood times consequence. You should only be doing consequence in order to generate, are you managing that approach?
Because there's 100% likelihood it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So in media supply chain, you get remediations that are found in the audits. And some people like Disney say we can have no remediations. So you've got to close all remediations, you've got to fix everything before you can do any business. And in my view, that's completely the wrong approach, because that means that people will try and hide stuff and close stuff off and minimize stuff because you don't want stuff hanging around. I'd rather say there are always defects, there are always problems. Let's have them out there. And then as they flex and change, you can work out dynamically what your likelihood and consequence is.
So I think one of the reasons why the regulators in financial services have gone after resilience as impact only, assuming that it will happen, is because there is always a desire that we can spend a bit of money and stop it from ever happening. And if cyber has taught us anything, is we can't stop it from ever happening.
No matter how much you spend.
How much you spend. And I think given a choice between spending £10 stopping it from happening or £10 from making it hurt less when it does, most executives will choose to spend £10 stopping it from happening. And I think the worry of the regulators has always been, but when it does happen, you won't have spent £10 on making it hurt less.
No.
So they're trying to focus people's attention on mitigations rather than controls. But I think the distinction I'm trying to make is between performance measurements, factors, risk factors, things that tell us whether the risk is getting bigger or smaller,
yeah,
and risks themselves.
Is it worth? Can you just explain to me what you did before about the things you're going to fix anyway, the risk, and then the resilience? Because that also plays into that conversation we had, just for the benefit of everybody, if we haven't said that before.
Okay, so that's my view on complexity and complicated and simple. So
risk registers. You said that you don't like risk registers because
they're way too simple and nobody ever uses them to make a decision, so why have them? But if you know what the problem is and you know it's going to happen fairly regularly, it's an issue, not a risk.
Yeah.
You're not saying I've got a chance that this is going to happen. What you're saying is it's going to happen, and it's going to happen once a month, or it's going to happen once a week.
Yeah.
Therefore, there is no point doing a risk assessment for something you know is going to happen. You just fix the issue.
Yeah. When
something is less likely to happen, but is somewhat predictable, so it will happen once a year, or it happen once every 6 months, and I'm pretty convinced of that. Then that can be managed through risk management. You can do the whole, what is a likely amount to spend on this to manage this risk. When something is unpredictable, so it may or may not happen once in the next 20 years, and that could be tomorrow, or it could be in 20 years' time.
And it's too expensive to fix.
It's very expensive, and it's unpredictable. Then risk is not a great tool. And instead, you want to start looking at experiments, sensing, threat hunting, those sorts of things to go and find the problems and solve them.
Plus resilience in response.
Plus resilience in response, where you stop worrying about if it's going to happen and you just treat it as though it does.
So we'll just summarize those. So you've got issues, you've got risks, you've got resilience, and to do the issues, you fix them, to do the risk, you assess it, and to do the resilience, you prepare for it.
Yes, but also sense for it.
Okay, sense, prepare and sense. I'm just thinking that, I mean, just going back to the original thing you said is, what are we going to do in this session? I think that chunk there is very, very useful. And the conversation about how you present your quantified risks back to get your budget. This bit about, how you you can't just do a simple risk register. How do you? But this has got to sit alongside all the other financial measures and all the other calls for budget. What's the last bit that goes into this session? If we think about it, from this session, from a risk session. I realize you and I
think terminology of not just issues, risk, and resilience, but what type of terminology needs to be used for risk budgeting. So Omar's post has some really good start for it, but we were going to talk about.
Is that in the chat, Omar?
I can send it. Yeah.
Perfect.
So I think one of the key things that would make this a session that was worth having is if we walked out with some guidance on what to measure and why.
Yeah.
It becomes practical and useful. I think most of our conversation. Sorry?
A cheat sheet for people to go back to. Yeah,
a cheat sheet for secure engineering, SRE. But I think we have to have the conversation about a sort of broad-ranging conversation about the why before we can get to the what. Is the unfortunate thing.
Can I add in something? And first of all, I apologize for being late. I did an interview, and so I'm still wearing my jacket, so that's not normal at all. Because bizarrely, it feels better for me to wear one when I'm doing an interview, even at home. What I've been really interested in over the last 2 years, especially since GDPR, is also just not the risk register type activity, but how do you measure the budget that we need to do for the risk transference? I'm talking about things like cybersecurity or cyber insurance, or by outsourcing. How do we manage what's not actually on premise, or how do we manage what's monitoring all of the various where is my data in the different cloud things as well? Because that's a conversation I'd be very interested in, especially with where you're getting services through your cyber insurance versus how you're managing all of your different outsourcing contracts.
So for cyber insurance, you're saying that how are you actually being honest about what your risks are, given that your expertise is probably much greater than the brokers?
Well, you have to be. I mean, the thing is, your insurance isn't going to work if you're not honest, and it's not your money; it's the company's money. So if the company doesn't get back their insurance if something happens, it's going to be your head on the block. I know it's a very interesting comment.
Plausible deniability often works with cyber insurance, so.
True.
So it's a very interesting point, and if you imagine most of the conversation we've had to now has been talking about what things we can measure to tell us if we're doing better or worse at security.
Yeah.
The cyber insurers and the brokers have the challenge of what do they measure about their customers to work out whether they are greater or lower risk.
Yep.
There are some more sophisticated models emerging. They're not very sophisticated, but they are coming forward. Almost all of them work on, I think, 2 questions. Have you been breached before, and how many customer records have you got? And that's pretty much it. I mean, that is the extent of the sophistication of their risk modeling on your behalf.
And have you got cyber experts that's recognized? Do you do quarterly pen tests, and then
They'll ask you a bunch of questions, but I spoke to somebody once who explained this to me. He said he's very careful not to have a huge set of questions that he asks is covered. And the reason being is if he asks them for information and it turns out they tell him something that was then later the cause of a breach, he can't then refuse to pay them the money.
Conversely, I know that there are some people out there where they ask some of those questions specifically because it can be useful post-breach. If you've said that you are going to fix things in a certain time period and you're demonstrably not doing so, then you can do it. So, insurance, right? Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, but BA got caught for that by not fixing the stuff that they found. They were given, a year to fix it, and they didn't do it. So, well, I was specific talking, so I was talking with our insurers for this, and before I left, I was working in Muller. And that's like that place is like a family-owned business. It's only got one owner, but earns 5.9 billion a year. So if anything happened in the 23 little diversity companies, they'd be done for, what is this? So like something 5.9 million or something. So I wasn't going to lie to the insurance. And I found from working with them that they're actually very interested in, I've been talking to a lot of them that are very interested in getting into the providing services from the insurer model, where if you buy these extra services as well as your insurance, then your premium will come down or your payout will be more. So that's probably what I wasn't explaining very well. So that kind of thing is very interesting for me to look at.
So we talked about what's practical coming out of this, and we talked about having a practical kind of the simulation stuff. We talked about having this cheat sheet of what to do, and then maybe we should have something about how you approach cyber insurance, because I think those would be three very practical things that might get some people who are normally, they're normally buried in a security role, and someone will pull them out to say, answer these 50 questions on a Word document, because I've got to get it back to my broker. And maybe if we got at least some guidance or a framework, then it means you're not just, again, like the cutout fuse. A lot of CISOs I see as being cutout fuses, which is the board turn to them and say, is everything okay? Yeah, we're all okay. And then something goes wrong and said, Dennis never told me that it was gonna happen. So actually having a more nuanced conversation where you're being more explicit, I think is worth doing.
Yeah, it worked really well. Oh, sorry, I've just finished off the final thing. Where this really comes from as well, it's an area that I really like, and I'm very interested in those services. But I facilitated a roundtable down in Munich about 6 months ago with all these guys from like Allianz and MAN and things like that, and it was looking at their different thinking on that I think would be interesting to get the opinions of. And like a group like this would be fascinating.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry, apologies, I'm running late as well, I had meetings. But yeah, it's really interesting, just hearing you guys speak. I've been having similar discussions with our enterprise director of risk. So, just looking after the business, and we were having discussions on whether we need insurance altogether. So, when you start offsetting risk, actually, when you start factoring in, do you have a cyber and information security team? Do you have the in-house capability to deal with a cyber attack? Do you have, third-party partners or whoever it is to leverage? The question then becomes, do you actually need cyber insurance? Do you have enough capability to deal with that, as opposed to getting cyber insurance? And it's an interesting question, because we were having that conversation, and from his angle, it was, well, actually, we can probably either get a lower tier, or we don't have to go all singing and dancing cyber insurance, as opposed to not at all. So it's a sliding scale, and again, that's risk management to a degree as well. You're managing your cyber insurance risk as well as just managing cyber risk or information security risk. I don't like using the word cyber.
Sorry.
Oh no, sorry. Sorry, slight delay. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, and the only other bit I thought would be quite good is you talked about GDPR, but that's the other place I've run into this where you get pulled out the security role, and is around ICO and actually looking at how you're dealing with some of your customer data. So that's where typically the CFO is going to be underpinning that. So maybe there's a set of kind of insurance regulatory things we could just discuss. And at the end of this session, we're giving what is largely a technical community a primer, a cheat sheet, a structure to go back and have a more balanced conversation with the business, rather than it just being looking at the technical merits at that time. But I don't know what people think, but I've only been to one open security summit, and there was a business track that was quite well attended, but it was coming out with some output from that would be useful.
So I think there's definitely a conversation we're having. There's a lot we can learn from each other. It's just worth bearing in mind, everything we're talking about at the moment is at some form of measurement.
Yeah.
Whether that be performance against budgets, whether that be insurance, whether that be risk. measurement of cybersecurity is one of the US government cyber research wicked problems that is very unlikely to be solved in the near term. So I think there's definite value for us to talk about this and to find, some practical, useful tips for people. I don't think we're going to solve it.
I was just going to say, again, I came late, so apologies. In all this discussion, are we mentioning that risk should be based on facts as opposed to pie in the sky? So when we've got a vulnerability, for example, I mean our company likes to call it cause, which I hate the term, but there is a cause that causes a risk, right? There's a vulnerability that causes a risk, and how much of that is done on facts as opposed to someone saying, "Oh, I think this is a problem," right? And then it gets measured. Is that something that we're bringing into this discussion? Because I think it's a really critical thing, because normally most people dismiss risk because it's hypothetical or it's not something that's measurable. So it's just like, well, that, I'm exec. I appreciate there's a risk, but tell me what do I need to fix? So is it factual?
Evidence-based.
Absolutely, evidence-based, factual, whatever it is, it has to be something that someone can either prove or disprove. So if it's a fact that we know, someone can disprove it, but it's still a fact that's been captured because of something that exists, something that's tangible.
So the problem is the domain of risk is the domain of uncertainty. It's things we don't know.
Absolutely, but there is something that makes that a risk. So something that causes that to happen. Otherwise, it doesn't. It's not a risk, right?
Well, so I had this conversation a little bit earlier. A risk is generally two things. It's an event and it's a consequence.
Yes.
And there might be multiple events involved and there might be multiple consequences. But ultimately, something has to happen and somebody has to get hurt somewhere. Otherwise, there is no risk.
Yes.
Everything else we talk about is a related factor. So the fact that I've got more vulnerabilities is telling me that my likelihood of the event occurring is higher, potentially.
Agreed.
The fact that I have more customer records is telling me that the potential consequence of the event is higher. But the customer records and the vulnerabilities are not the risk. That is the event and the consequence.
Correct, but it's based on fact. So the risk is based on fact as opposed to something someone thinks.
Yes, yeah. So it's an interesting one because you get into a lot of arguments with people about whether or not a risk is a real thing, especially in cyber, because the individual risks are shockingly rare. But the fact that a cyber risk, one of the millions and millions of cyber risks we have, is going to happen is pretty high. Any individual one is shockingly low. This is a real Swiss cheese model. But it's what we are generally doing in risk, and I'm exposing my bias here, is we are measuring our uncertainty about the future. So if we know that something's going to happen, it's not a risk.
Yes.
If we think that something's going to happen and we can be relatively confident that we're right, then it's a risk.
Yes.
If we think something might happen, but we have no idea whether it will or won't, that's not a risk.
Can I draw another analogy? I don't know if anyone here has been involved in sales, but what all the businesses will be very used to is a sales forecast, where you call out the risk of selling something, and then you measure whether you actually sold it or not. And if you don't meet your budget or don't meet your quota, then as a salesman you go. Now, I'm just thinking of trying to work out a model here of how you present. I mean, that's a positive risk in a sell something, but there's a presenting the risks in that way as a forecast, because what's implicit in that is you can go and measure as a salesperson, did you actually sell that thing? And therefore, whether it's the event has actually happened and what the impact of that event was. I'm just wondering if there's a model there in terms of how we communicate back to a business who will be all about revenues and checking on budgets and where, what the prediction is going to be and how accurate that prediction was. And I've been involved where there's been quite a lot of calibration of sales people of doing that estimate. And similarly in software development, you're getting your software teams to say, how long is this going to take you to build? And you can kind of get a degree of how conservative the software person is by, they always say it's going to take 10 days and deliver it in 5 days. You get them to strip those factors of safety out. I'm just wondering what mechanisms we can use to get people to think about this in terms of how they communicate outside of the security community.
I don't disagree with the idea, but I think if your job is more around preventing something bad from happening, it drives the wrong behaviors if you start measuring them on whether the bad things happened or not. Because the first thing I'm then going to do is stop measuring whether anything bad's happened and tell you that everything's fine.
And this is the story of security measurement.
So
nobody measures anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is partly driven by the fact that if there is a breach, there's immediate calls for the CISO to go because they obviously didn't do a good enough job.
Yeah, the cutout fuse.
And but while organisations are not mature enough to understand whether that's serious enough, whether they were negligent or whether it was just as a result of maybe it's something that the business has acquired 20 other businesses over the last 10 years, not bothered to do any proper integration of them, hired the CISO 12 months ago, and there's no way that anyone could have fixed that. There's actually the responsibility there was the person who's approved all the mergers and acquisitions, not the CISO. And that's where I think the maturity isn't there yet to kind of properly adopt those sorts of quite clean cut kind of thing.
Yeah. I guess there's a different angle from this. While we're talking
it's
about,
not a bad idea though. I do like the idea of being, you're talking about being able to measure someone's performance in role, and that isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, no, it's that. But I'm just thinking the other side, the value add. So there's, are we measuring, or how can we measure the value that we get from doing something? So an example is mobile device protection, right? We've just done mobile device protection. And the data we get from that actually helps the business drive forward with next time when they're doing a refresh, they can save 500 devices that they don't have to give out to users because they never turn them on, because we can see that from the mobile security device protection. All of a sudden, that becomes a tangible cost, right? We might have spent 100 grand on this, but actually we've saved 200 or 300 grand, in 2 years' time. And that's something that I don't think we do well enough to actually show, because that's the value as well in terms of, we are preventing something bad, but we're also giving you something good. And then that becomes I think that's something that we should be measuring. And it could be a, application, it could be a solution, it could be it could be anything, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I've spoken about this a few times. Businesses tend to run on the bottom line and the top line. So the sales targets that Ben's talking about, that's the top line. Go and get me some new revenue. Go and get me some new money.
Yeah.
Bottom line is, how much am I making once I've spent what I needed to make to get the top line? So my costs come off the bottom. There is generally, security is entirely a bottom line conversation. There is a little bit about reputation and ability to sell on the top line if you've had a breach, and it's pretty hard to measure. But almost entirely, security is either the cost of the security team themselves versus the risk exposure that security team is reducing, which has the potential to turn into unplanned expenses. And if you talk to a chief financial officer about a multi-million-pound unplanned expense in the middle of his annual budget, you get his attention very quickly. So the benefit of people keep talking about, security as an enabler, we make money for the business. Excuse my language.
Yeah.
What we actually do is we minimize unplanned expenditures in budget, traded off against the cost of our teams and controls and everything that we do that with.
And I just
find other business benefits fantastic, but that's our core role in life.
And I'd add in, when I look at ROI, I think there are 3 reasons for ROI. You increase revenue, you decrease cost, headcount, or you mitigate risk. And my concern is it's very easy to say, what's the cost of buying a bit of business for revenues? Very easy to say, I cut my staff in half, I take out £400,000. But the last bit is mitigating risk. It isn't quantified. So I think I agree with you, but I think there's probably, if you can quantify the risk, then those unplanned events that you talked about, that's a risk mitigation. And I like your model of the issues, risks, and resilience. I think because I think most people have to take account of business continuity. All the tenders in media and entertainment, they have a big element that says, what happens if your edit suite goes down? What happens if you lose your connectivity? You know, what happens if, you know, so there's a lot of focus already on business continuity. That's a language the CFO needs to speak.
Yeah, agreed. Both models I think are brilliant. The thinking, I mean, as well, if you think about it, like in the last couple of months, what have we gone through? You know, we've gone through what the ultimate security modeling exercise is. And like for me, like I come from telecom networks, so very much firewalls, VPNs, architecture, so those kind of things that we, you know, which I like the idea that it's not quantifiable, but I've always worked for the CTO, and then it's like you get used to finding those specifics very quickly if you're trying to pull budget out of him when he's trying to pay for all the MSANs at the same time. But this thing that we've gone through is an excellent exercise, I think, in thinking about that risk versus what security you've actually given in terms of the architecture of remote access into the networks. And the security teams differ whether they're IT focused or network focused. Because mine have always been network focused, we've had those VPN teams, those Cisco guys in as well, all the people looking after the ISP or working within it. And then you can very easily go, well, we kept everybody working for the last 3 months. There you go. That's the benefit of security. It's
yeah. I'm just wondering if we did this. I don't know what the planning of the schedule is, Dilar, but if we had we could just do a really fast kind of half an hour, 45-minute run through of the 4 blocks you just talked about right at the beginning of the event, just so that people can dip into it, and then maybe have a longer discussion session where people can get more involved in it. But because I like the idea of talking about what's the definition of risk, you know, what you were talking about, Phil, the event and consequence, and then talking about quantification, performance measurement. I think there's a whole bunch about how to measure everything. That kind of works quite well. And the new risk register. And then the last bit could be about cyber insurance, cloud, you know, because I think when you get to cloud, you've got, you can't ignore the consequences of a very small change. I mean, we talk about putting redundancy and resilience, and in the cloud, you don't have to pay for that. Normally, you until it happens, you can have it set up, and then you can spin up the servers when you need them. Whereas in the past, when I was working in the London market insurance, you know, people would buy massive data centers and another one just in case, or a trading floor. So I'm just wondering if we did structure the session and we did a really brief overview initially, and then we had a more detailed session later in the week, which was discussion, that would be quite useful.
So the session at the summit is currently scheduled for the day 18th, which is a Thursday, between 8 to 9 p.m. UK time.
Okay.
Quite a late time, but the first 20 minutes, I think it's great. But who's going to talk about them? Who is going to be running them? Who wants to take actions?
If we structure these bullet points, so I think there's a lot of materials. I mean, Phil's got some great presentations on this. I know we can have some different voices coming into it. We could you know, do that 20-minute run through, which covers the main points like present mode, and then we can jump into these topics. But the end result, and what we should probably publish coming out of this session, is like a primer that says here's the cheat sheet, here is the synopsis of these 4 clusters, and there may be more, 4 clusters of information, and then here is the guide that you should go and use. Because I think it's I think people would probably find that quite useful, because they you know, this is the sort of thing they don't see day to day, and then suddenly they get dragged into an office and say, comment on cyber insurance, or comment on you know, your regulatory risk.
So what I'm hearing, Ben, what might be quite useful is you have a similar setup to normal someone being the SME and having a discussion. Could be useful having almost a panel of people that are discussing it to bounce off of, because I think it's a wide topic, and I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution. And you know, I think everyone has a lot of value to add to the discussion, and you know, it's very likely that it's probably going to bring a new something out of this, a new model, or a new you know, workflow or something. And I think that might be quite interesting, rather than it being one person like Ben or Phil or someone just taking the lead. I think that could be really valuable.
Yeah, I think 12 minutes or 4 people talking about it would be
a
good idea.
Yeah,
and Omer should be one of them with his podcast.
So I'll take the action just to summarize those 4 points, and let's put that on a shared doc and work out where we put it in. But I think if we did that first 20 minutes into a 5-minute talk on each, and maybe get 4 speakers, we could do a very quick run through it, and then we're into a panel session. So people, if they want to rock up for the first 20 minutes and just listen, they may not want to get involved in the discussion. If people want to stick around, they can.
Yeah, and it'd be good to get everyone's thoughts and feedback, because I think that's, I think that the value, and I think this is where working with Dennis, as I have, he likes to be challenged. He likes input from other people. He likes, what about this? Even if it is going against what's being said, that's useful because it does challenge the whole thing, right? So I think that could be interesting. And I think, I think Phil's probably the closest to solving the problem, but I don't think anyone here can claim to have solved the problem, and I don't think we ever will. But it's having that holistic conversation would be really valuable for everyone, included us. I think I think that would be really good.
Yeah,
I think I can do a lot of the theory. If people can bring their practical experience of what works, then we can build something useful.
And what I was hoping to is I'm going to talk about media and entertainment and about security controls and what I'm doing for cloud in that. And what I'm going to do is point to this session and say within there is a chunk around risk, and this is here's the primer of what you should be doing to tackle that. And I'm going to point back to Wardley Maps here. So what I'm going to try and do is link my session into kind of these other sessions, and then hopefully people can follow a track, and they've got a kind of like for what you were saying, Phil, there's a model exercise. There's actually a domain where these things you can check on. So we talked about supply chain and about the size of companies in supply chain. I'm pretty sure by the time I get to the session, I'll have the data on how big the median, the average supplier is in that supply chain, and you can then make some assertions about how many security staff will be in that company. And it's probably less than 1.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about bringing risk to the average person in the organisation. So one of the things we did was
a distinctly average person, yeah.
When I say the average person, i.e. non-cyber security, someone not in cyber, someone who doesn't understand risk. What does it actually mean? So we've had some good discussions, because it's been based around that this is what it means. It's really simple language. It gives you a voice. It doesn't matter where you are, because it allows you to talk to the exec and vice versa. There is that, and that's where we've approached. But I think also we've talking about the sort of vendor management, third-party vendor management. We're talking risk. So whenever we assess vendors, they're always low, medium, and high. And we've got a tiering system that works really well. So if it's a high risk, it goes to exec for them to sign off, which they never do. If it's a medium, if it's a medium risk supplier, then it needs to be signed off by whoever owns that product or platform. And then if it's low, then we will accept that as a low risk, and it carry on as you are. So there's no such thing as a no risk supplier. But and it's been really powerful, because it's actually, we've had tenders. So we go through a tender process, and we would have so many suppliers that would be coming in through the tender process, through the back door essentially. And then we've started measuring that, giving that, and actually, majority of them wouldn't go through without scrutiny. And it's been really interesting, because whenever you flag a high risk, they ask why, and you say this is why, and they're like, okay, we don't want to do that. And it was really interesting, because all of a sudden it brings that risk to something that people do normally. And
it's removing plausible deniability. Just because they're not an expert in foreign exchange doesn't mean they can't say what happens if our dollar sales don't count as so much. And in the same way, from a cyber point of view, just because Dennis has told them that it's okay, they should still have an idea about what that means.
Absolutely.
Hi, AJ.
Mute.
AJ is going to fly to you in his X-Wing
Good afternoon, all. Sorry, I was just tapping away in the chat rather than interrupting.
Okay.
So we have discussed a lot of things, and we're going to make a summary of everything we discussed. So that
Excellent.
not here, not now, but
Oh, damn.
but I'm sure you will be involved. We will have a 20-minute session at the 20-minute section at the beginning of the actual session in the summit to give this as a primer. And then at this summit, hopefully at the end of the 2 hours, we will come up with a cheat sheet.
So there'll actually be an output, and the output will be something that a security person in an organization has a way of approaching how what risk is, how risk is quantified, how that should be measured and monitored on a register, and how that, be it reliability or issues, resilience or issues, and then also at the end of it, you know, when you get asked about cyber insurance or regulatory or cloud, what that means.
Some terminology and theory will be Phil's responsibility to type up.
Ah, okay.
And we will also request Omar to give a 5-minute introduction to his blog post, which he will also turn into a repository, and we might feed into that, or it might become something different, all up to discussion.
Great. And apologies, guys, I've got to drop. I've got for my next call, but thank you very much. I'll if I just drop those bullet points out to the group, then let's put them in a shared doc and amend them.
I will create a document that we can share, and I will send it to you first. And once you put in your stuff, we can share it to wider audience.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Goher, I don't know if that I pronounced that correctly.
That's fine. Yep.
You're gonna do a bringing risk to the average person.
I don't mind talking about that. Not to the average person, to outside of security. Let's put it that way.
The non-security person.
Yeah, I don't want to call people average. Might get shot for that. So
Makes sense. Yeah, that is good.
Cool. So I think we got to a resolution after much conversation.
Yeah, I haven't led it very well, did I? But I'm still recovering from illness, so that will be my excuse.
That's all right. I think we came in with not particularly well-defined goals, so it's good that we've come out with some.
That is correct. And I don't have the type of energy that Dennis has, so.
I don't think anyone does, Dida. Let's be honest. So.
Anything else? Alan, you're on mute.
I am. I'm getting some interference from left field. No, I'll look to read the summary and see what I can do to assist that. Phil, if you need some help with those notes, I suppose, whether that's a second opinion or dotting I's, crossing T's. But I like what you write anyway, so probably unneeded.
I'm worried about what I'm doing now. Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing Ben's bullet points.
Okay.
Cool. That will be the first step then. Baby steps, guys. You can't change the world without the baby steps. Taking baby steps first. All right. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you so much for joining. It's been really productive, and hope to see you soon.